Okay, this is something new for the Mocha Love YouTube channel. Today we're doing a little interview. This is for a class, but we're doing a little interview. Uh, I'm here with Philip Hudson Brown III. Do you want to give yourself a little introduction? Tell us who you are, why you're here.
I'm here because you asked me to be here,
That's a pretty good reason.
and you told them who I am.
Yep.
So,
Uh, so today we're gonna talk about a lot of things about the black experience, the suburban black experience to be specific.
all
Uh,
right.
Can you talk a little bit about your what you used to do before you got to where you are now in your bougie apartment?
All right. Well, before that, I used to be a inner city substance abuse counselor. Uh, got a degree in psychology slash therapy slash recreation.
Okay.
So, from the Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville, uh, professional credentials, RASAC 1, RASAC 2, which those are registered associate substance abuse counselor, then CSAC 1 and 2, which is certified substance abuse counselor. It's also a child intervention specialist. So my whole thing was in substance abuse was really to work with adolescents and then children that were dealing with their parents' addiction and how that's affected them.
hmm So to get started, I guess I want to talk about some personal experience. You were a kid once. You went to
Yeah,
high
many
school
many moons ago.
many moons ago. So can you talk to me a little about what your high school experience was like, or I guess your whole school experience, not just high school?
Uh, so you where do you want me to start? You want me to start in elementary
No, I
school?
don't want you. Okay, we're more looking for like an emphasis on like segregation you might have noticed through school. Obviously, you aren't so old the schools were segregated still, but
Pretty close.
yeah, pretty close. They were de facto
Pretty close.
segregated.
I was born in '63, so pretty
Right.
close.
So let's just talk to me a little about that.
Okay, so I will go to elementary school for a little bit because the school I went to Hickey. It's still there in North St. Louis. It was pretty much all black school. Well, pretty much it was an all black school.
hmm
Until so that was the experience you had education wise, stories, the the things that you were taught about history, everything was centered around a blackness as opposed to the multicultural way that you get it when you move. Now, I went
hmm
from that in eighth grade, I went to a school where there was like five of us.
Yeah.
Couldn't even get a good basketball team because there was only
No.
five of us and a couple of them were girls.
Sure. Sure. Can't fill out the roster with five people.
So it was different where and it was kind of a culture shock. I mean, my parents always taught us to get along with everybody, treat people the way you want to be treated, which
hmm
I don't know if we do enough of that these days. So, but there's also growing up in a completely urban and a segregated thing. You start to hear stories or myths like white people don't wash their hands, so
Sure.
don't eat it. So don't eat at their house because they don't do that.
Sure. Sure.
Some stuff you find out is true because they don't season their meat
That's
all the time.
Come on.
No,
Come
no,
on.
I'm
They're going to
just
be listening to this. You can't do them like that.
so, I but you hear those kind of stories in the same way that whites and other cultures hear stories about blacks. I mean,
hmm
it's not like it doesn't go both ways.
Right.
So go ahead.
Right. So, I guess to get a little more poignant to specific color, uh, there's obviously there's shades of blackness, there's shades of whiteness and whatnot. How how have you noticed in your childhood and maybe even in your professional experience how that affects black culture, both from whites looking at blacks and vice versa?
So the looking at it from like other blacks, there was always the high yellow person, or I
Hmm.
mean, it would be the whole thing, light bright, almost white. Especially if it was a girl, they were always considered pretty
Hmm.
because generally there was something different about the eyes. That they may be really light brown, almost hazel. Some people even had green eyes, and it was just skin kind of glowed and it looked different. So, but on the other side,
Hmm.
the really, really dark skinned people kind of got picked on because of their darkness, get called midnight, to look like a tire, all
Right.
really derogatory things. So they had a chip, but the light skinned people had a chip too because people would just like tease them. Like the girls had a chip, but it was different because like they seemed to always, no matter what they looked like, seemed to always get hit on. And it's interesting because as you go further on and kind of do some research and think about it, it was that was kind of the setup where people were saying, okay, well, you know, white woman was always on everything as the trophy, so the really
Right.
light skinned black person was a way of having the trophy but still being with a black person.
Right.
So
So let's talk about professional experience now. In your work as a counselor, the children's child abuse, child alcohol abuse counselor, substance abuse. That's the word I'm looking for. Um, how did you see racism affect that, segregation affect that?
where I really saw it was we expanded the program to New Orleans,
Hmm.
and New Orleans is put into different parishes, and it's almost like when you go down there, there's several parishes that just kind of look like what used to be like Blue Mire and Pruitt-Igoe here, housing projects.
Sure.
And the crime rate was so high in those areas because you people really weren't didn't get out of that area that much. Things were made so they couldn't get out. They were priced out of it. They were policed back into it.
Right.
So we saw it a lot there. A lot of the kids that I had to work with came out of some of the, which they aren't there now, because there used to be where the football stadium is downtown, or housing projects basically were torn down for that. So,
Okay.
and then all those little condos and stuff came in there. So Caucasians started moving back in there. But
Hmm.
I mean, it just used to be where there was. I mean, there was a lot of crime. There's a lot of homelessness. The homelessness is still there, but whereas people that were in those areas were thought to be uneducated, thugs, the lowest of the low, and people just try to stay away from them.
Right. And how did that affect the children, the adolescents?
I had a kid that lived in that area, and he was always fearful for his life because he dealt drugs. That's how he was basically. His mom was in rehab in one of the other areas, but he was dealing drugs to try to take care of his family because she was strung out. Um, he felt like he could never get. He had no hope of getting away from that. It's like this has to be my life because there's no. He said there's nowhere I can go where people don't know me.
Hmm.
And I was like, well, I just met you a few weeks ago, so I didn't know you. So,
Sure.
but he's like, that's not. It's like, yeah, because I came here, but my hood was basically a 10-block radius.
Right.
And I remember, against better judgment of a lot of people, putting him in a car and driving him to the suburbs,
Hmm.
which is unfortunate. This he had actually never been, and he lives downtown St. Louis, and you know that the arch and the river is right there. He'd
Right.
never been across the river to Illinois,
Hmm.
even though he could see it most of the time.
Right.
And that's kind of what happens is we get stuck in these pockets of things, and we feel like that's our whole world.
Right.
And what a lack of hope, a lack of seeing that there is a better way to do things because we don't have the access or the resources to get to it.
Right. So I'm actually going to jump around from this outline we have here,
Okay.
and that because that's a really good lead into talking about the suburbs and what's going on out there. Because I think there's a certain motivation to move out to the suburbs because they have more resources, because they're they're whiter and they have more money. They kind of coincide. So I'm curious. Obviously, we moved to the suburbs. I'm
Correct.
curious as to why we did that. What were some of the motivations?
So, what's really funny is when I was thinking about this, because you feel like we moved to the suburbs.
Hmm.
Well, when you were born in Ferguson,
Sure, that's not the city.
which is a suburb,
Right. Right.
but we moved to a more white suburb.
Sure.
The crazy thing is, and most people, whoever hear this will see this, and I'm just going to give this little plug for Ferguson. Ferguson was probably the better environment and the better example of people getting along of different races and cultures than probably most of the places that we're talking about
Hmm.
because it had a very, very strong African American community. It had a very strong white Christian community, and it had a very strong multicultural mixed race families in there,
Right.
all doing their thing together. I mean, there's restaurants that you can still go to eat at in Ferguson. People see the riots. It wasn't black and white people fighting each other. It was fighting against the police and what happened.
Hmm.
But black and white people were still walking past each other all the time and not having issues. People don't realize that around some of what people would call urban decay in Ferguson, there is a bunch of really expensive homes there. And
Right.
if you look back to the riots, where you remember when they went down the one street where the library was, how the police came out and made sure they didn't go any further, because that's where those $400,000 houses are.
Right. I'm gonna say
Like,
there's a sharp increase.
it's like, yeah, you're not getting ready to mess with this.
Right. So, I guess kind of that leads me into like what's left behind when you move out to a predominantly white suburb from an environment where, as you said, it's ethnically diverse compared to where we live now.
The problem was that the school system wasn't the
Mm.
same.
Yes.
And in order to give opportunity, you have to get your kids to a better system.
Hmm.
I don't know if you remember back to swimming.
Hmm.
You swam against the Ferguson Forest Swim
Yeah.
Club that had like 5 kids on it.
Hmm.
Your swim team from out here had like 50.
Right.
And that's the difference. There aren't the same opportunities and resources. There isn't the same funding that goes in tax dollar wise economics. So, although it was a better environment for cultural interaction and dialogue and understanding,
Hmm.
where you may have wanted to go with your life or where your parents may have wanted you to go with your life, they knew you couldn't give it to you there. You couldn't send you to that in that school district. So the thing was always to pay for private school.
Hmm.
But it became a lot cheaper and better to just move, relocate to what we would try to get out of a private school.
Right. So does doing that bring up any concerns about losing culture, losing aspects of the black culture that you're now leaving behind in hopes of finding a better education?
Oh, sure, it does damage. It
Hmm.
it does damage because I remember when my parents sent me to Lutheran North and how much crap I had to take, and as a high school student, fights I would get into coming home because I was now a sellout,
Mm.
which is really ironic because Lutheran North has a ton of black kids in it now. Like it's kind of become the way, but at that point, it's like, hey, you're too good for us. You're leaving us behind.
Hmm.
So when you leave that place, if you don't go back, then there's a void in the area that you left, which is why you see so many successful black people go back and try to pull somebody out. Always a joke in Hollywood: one black person work, everybody got to work. But that's why,
Right.
because you don't want to leave a community behind to where it continues to decay. If you take all the every community has good, in between, and bad.
Hmm.
If all the good goes away and never comes back, then you're just left with in between and bad.
Right. And that's not good either. So I guess that's probably a good transition into this scale I sent you last night, the African American Acculturation Scale. So,
Yes, I see it's politically correct now because it used to be the black acculturation scale, but I see
yeah,
that
they
you.
changed the name. They changed the name. Uh, so I guess my first question, why does this exist? Why do we need this?
Because someone decided, because why do we need this? Because if you, at first glance, it seems really ridiculous.
Sure.
But when you go through it and you realize that these things are associated with African American culture,
Hmm.
and if you have people just answering every question one or two or three, the more that happens, the more that culture itself is being lost.
Yeah. So I went through it myself last night, and I had my roommate go through it. My roommate is very white. I thought I was doing pretty. I know there's not this scale. For those of you that haven't seen it, I can actually share it. Haha. Um, Let me pull this up. This is what it looks like. Uh, you can see that there's these questions, and then there's just numbers that you associate with how strongly you think. Like, I strongly agree, absolutely true. Do I totally disagree? Not true at all. I went through it. I was around here most of the time, three, four, fives, a few six, sevens. This one, a firm seven. But uh, my roommate did not achieve that. He was sitting at the one, twos, and threes, which makes sense. I was I was raised with a black father, so that makes sense to me. But it's it's interesting to me that some of these things I don't know anything about, and I think that's partially because of where we were. That's partially just
Can you give an example?
sure. Like this is a good question. I have read or used to read Essence magazine. I have never read an Essence magazine. I know what it is. I've never read it. The
Okay.
questions about collard greens. I've had collard greens once in my life, one single time. One.
Okay. Okay, and you know why that is?
What?
Your mom hates them.
Mm. We're gonna
Your
talk.
mom.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about that dynamic later. But yeah, most definitely. Another one. One or more of my relatives know how to do hair. Very a low answer on this one. The only person that I know that can do hair is you, and you can cut it. I don't know anyone else that can like braid or do anything like that.
Okay, so your auntie Rib Tips can do hair.
Yeah, I don't know that. I never knew that until right now.
Yeah, she used to do Brandy, Sharon. Yeah, she can do hair.
Yeah, it's just it's there's something that I totally recognize. People say I eat too much salt. You used to say it to me all the time that I have too much sodium, and yeah, so I definitely put a 7 on that one. There's things in here that I don't think I thought about as a cultural thing until I started reading it and looking at my people other people doing it that aren't a part of the culture at all. I'm just
So there was a question on there that I'm really gonna miss it. I'm interested in just what your answer was, and maybe
mhm.
we can do that off camera.
Oh, you can do it now. It's all right.
It's the one that said something about members of my family hate white people.
Right. That's for me that's a weird question because I have white people that I know had a history of racism and I have black people that experience said racism. So it's hard to hate something that's half of you. But at the same time, I can sit here and recognize the faults and whatnot.
Well, I was gonna say it's interesting. The reason why that was interesting to me, and the same one where I don't trust most white people, it's because you being biracial,
Hmm.
you have a different experience. Like you're further removed from like my uncles and stuff that fled the South to flee white people. So,
Right.
but you don't know them. You
No.
don't have a relationship with them, so you wouldn't know any of that.
Yeah.
And
It's
and I think that is part of where this the disconnect and how we start losing culture is because one of the big things that we used to do as I was growing, we used to have family reunions
hmm
and we get together. Now I kind of talk to my cousins and stuff through Facebook now, so we don't have to really do the big family reunions. Although they still do them, we just don't ever go.
hmm
But that was a staple of what we do. The same way I told you that we used to get together on Sundays, have a big dinner, play bid, and
hmm
that's something that don't necessarily do. I'll tell you one of the biggest cultural things that's not on here.
hmm
Okay, so think about the two different Christmases, or when we did two different Thanksgivings.
Right.
Think about how one is you show up when you show up, and you stay as long as you want to. The other
Right.
was like we got to get an hour and a half in, and we gone.
They're the start and end time. Right. Right. We're there until you're tired and you just gotta be awake enough to drive home.
Well, remember it used to be before everybody started getting older. It used to be you'd wake up, they're still there.
Right.
You go to bed, they still be there the next day, which is why there's the ton of food is made because people are going to be at your house for 3 or 4 days. It's a mini vacation.
Right. And I guess that that brings me to uh you and mother. For those of you that haven't figured it out now, this is my dad. But uh, you obviously married a white woman.
Yes, I did. She's very white.
So I guess
Although
before
she said the census says she's black now
I don't know about all
because
that.
we're a black
I
family
don't know about. I don't
because of
think that's
me.
correct. Mathematically, that does not check out. Um, so before we talk about like that dynamic and where we're at, can you, did you experience any backlash from that? Any negative speech, rhetoric?
Oh yeah.
Hmm.
So little B knows my mother was fine with it, except but she wasn't really fine with it. But now she's great with it
Okay.
because her response was, "If you like it, I love it." And if anybody knows, if you hear that from a black person, that means you stupid idiot.
Yeah.
So if you didn't know, that's what that's code for. But no, she so there was that.
Hmm.
I remember her. This is really weird because it's because you're talking about your
Right.
grandma and
It's just
grandpa.
twice removed or once removed, I guess.
Look, to try to keep her from doing it, they offered to pay for her to go spend the summer in Europe.
Right.
And I know at one point they took her on a trip to the east, and while they were there, tried to fix her up with another dude. So,
Hmm.
and then we also had the conversation where your grandma was like, "You really can't bring mixed kids in this world, can you?
Hmm.
Like, look at the children. What's that going to do to them?"
Uh, how do you think it went? The mixed
Well,
children situation.
you're still here.
That's true. If that is our bottom bar.
There are things. It is like anything else. It depends on how you look at it. There are things that maybe she was right about because there were struggles. There were struggles that you were going to have. Your brother is going to have
Mm,
that your sister doesn't have.
right.
Now she has her own things,
Sure.
she's black,
Right.
and everybody looks at her like they know what she is, and
Hmm.
it's really not your issue. It's other people's issue with having to put you in a box and not just being able to appreciate the essence of who you are. It is getting better because there are so many mixed children out there, but depending on where you are, and you know this, depending on what group you are, you have to change your dialect. You have to change the music you listen to. You
Right.
may have to change what you're wearing.
Right. That's code switching. We do it all the time here. All
Yep.
uh, my friends at school, we always talk about how many times we can code switch a day. How the little slight things will take even just one word out of our vocabulary just for one conversation, just because we know that that person is going to see it in a way that they're not supposed to see it in. So I guess that brings me to just being in the suburbs then, because I assume you also have had to code switch since we moved so long ago.
I have to code switch on a daily basis.
Hmm.
I have to go and switch in the same 5 minutes. You know that,
Yeah.
depending on who walks in.
Right.
And I think what people don't appreciate with that code switching and how quick you have to do it, and you do it without even thinking about it, is that makes you tired.
Right.
It makes you really tired. And if you're not on your game that day, you can sing, oh, what's wrong with you? Why you so moody?
Right.
I'm not being moody. Why you in a bad mood? And it's like, you're too good for us today. I'm like, no, that's I'm thinking about something and I'm tired.
Right.
And I don't want to have to be the person that you're expecting to me
Mm.
to be or want me to be so that I can be accepted by you.
Right. And I think part of the problem is that it's seen as unprofessional, seen as uneducated. And I guess some of the reason for that is that nobody speaks like that, especially where I went to high school. Nobody talks like that.
So okay, so here is the thing. As good as I am, and here's the difference I can tell you, because you grew up more suburban.
Hmm.
I never thought I had an urban dialect. I never did.
Sure.
It's like I've been refined, gone to really good schools,
Been refined.
studied the King's English. I thought I didn't have
Sure.
an urban dialect
Sure.
until two things: AT&T and Google.
Yeah.
When AT&T came out with, when you call in and you can't talk to a person, you have to go through the voice menu.
Hmm.
Couldn't understand a word I was saying. Google constantly, when I'm talking to it, you've read many of
Oh.
my speech to text. It has no idea what I'm saying.
Nope. Yeah. Um, I think that's reminiscent of the bigger issue of the mm, the forced acculturation of black people into a white, predominantly white society. Oh, he's got he's taking a message.
No, that is completely what it is, because you can't necessarily, and I think that's the part that people have to understand. It's, you can't necessarily be yourself 100% of the time and still be accepted.
Hmm.
Where the issue comes from you being mixed, it's being 100% of yourself all the time means you're not fully accepted in a black culture and you're not fully accepted in a white culture.
Sure.
You're your own cultural experience that is some of both. It's a hybrid, and you would think in 2021 people wouldn't care, but they still do.
Right. So that brings me straight into, I guess, some of the fears you have living in the suburbs. I think there's the sort of anxiety living out there surrounded by so many people that are nothing like you. Just curious what that's like for you.
Well, what you do is you come up with coping mechanisms or defense mechanisms that allow you to be successful.
Hmm.
For me, it just turned into the angry black man and folks back off you.
Sure, if it works.
It has worked my entire life. I mean, it's worked since high school, because you start using those stereotypes to your advantage.
Sure.
And sometimes, and that's not what you want to do, because you've been raised better than that.
Hmm.
You know that that's not the right thing psychologically to do. But sometimes you just have to get somebody off you.
Right. So how does that? I think okay. I'm gonna preference this question.
I'm gonna go get the dog.
I think there's a.
Are you gonna end up staying
Oh,
there?
but I'll wait. I'll let you take your.
Well, I'm kind of scared to go
Right.
out, but
So
you're gonna do.
I think there's a bit of a misconception about suburbia and whatnot, especially for black people coming in. I think people think that they're escaping the city. There's a fear, and they're running from it. And I'm not convinced that that's correct.
Okay, so let me say this: how many black people have you known run from another black person?
Well, yeah, that's why I want to talk about it.
I'm like, come on.
Right. So what is it then? What besides there's education obviously, but what I feel like there's a lot that you leave behind moving to a suburb. Like
Yeah, there you leave a lot of your culture behind, but you also leave behind falling down buildings and everything else. Urban decay.
urban decay.
You also leave behind being treated like you're a criminal. I've told you the story of when my aunt passed away and she left me a $20,000 check
Mhm.
that I went to cash at our multicultural bank in Ferguson. But because I'm a black man, they're like, you stole this. And they tried to keep it.
Good.
And I actually left with a security guard chasing me,
Yeah.
even though it was made out to Philip H. Brown III.
So how do you
But let me tell you how that story ended.
All right.
Obviously, we live in St. Peter's now.
We do.
My Caucasian wife I signed the check, and then she signed it, took it to the bank out here in St. Peter's, and they just cashed it for her.
Hmm.
No questions asked. Just let me see your ID there.
So that's some of the more institutionalized and systemic problems that you can see in suburban environments and whatnot. The predominantly white institutions that just aren't made with minorities in mind.
Yeah, that systemic institutionalized racism that doesn't exist until you
Right.
experience it. But if you're not black, you can't experience it.
Sure. So I guess stuff like little stuff like that. Like what do you have some other examples that you've experienced since you've moved out there?
Besides the neighbor that things that would celebrate black people flies his Confederate flag.
Well, sure.
Besides that,
But even little things like that, it sows some fear to live there, to be in your home and around the corner. You have to look at that every day.
I mean, all the normal things where the police follow you. Best thing that I ever did was get personalized plates. I have gotten followed so much less by the police because of the personalized plates
I have noticed that as
because they
well.
know who it is.
Right. That's
But
interesting. I never considered that, but now that you
no,
mention
because
it,
no, because that's always been the thing. Is like, hey, don't get a personalized plate because if you do something wrong, they're gonna know it's you.
right,
But it's like, oh yeah, he's all right. Don't worry about him.
right, yeah. So I guess we'll start wrapping things up. Um, obviously you're an old wise man now.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but
All right. Well, for the purposes of this, you're an old wise man.
okay.
How do we move forward from here? Obviously, we still got problems, especially in the suburban, predominantly white areas. How do we move forward, specifically with regards to giving children a way to see that this isn't how it's supposed to be and that they can make it better?
So one of the things that we have to do, and my biggest concern is all the noise with critical race theory, whatever you want to call it, trying to take, and I'm actually hearing this now, it want to change history or don't talk about parts of history because we don't want white children to grow up feeling bad about themselves because their ancestors enslaved black people.
Sure. That's not really what it's about, but
Well, no, that's what's going on now. I
Right.
mean, there's many states that are coming up are trying to remove race period from school. I'm like, white people have enslaved all cultures for years. So
True.
I mean, like, read the Bible. I
Yeah.
mean, come on.
Quite the history of it, actually.
So, and that I don't. That's what seems to happen as we go. Every change is a bridge too far. So we overcorrect things, and then it ends up making a mess. And while you're, and I'm not sure that some of that isn't by design because it distracts you from the main the main goal of everybody succeeding. The one the one thing that I have learned through 58 years of life is that it doesn't matter how good things are for me if there's a ton of other people struggling because I'm still going to have to work harder because those other people are struggling because I'm going to have to fund those other people because the humanity wants to keep them alive.
Right. It's hard for people to see that when they are so far away from it, so far removed from that.
Well, and you hear the okay, I worked hard and I earned this, so I should I shouldn't have to worry about something else. And I get that, and no one's trying to change or say that someone didn't work hard and accomplish what they have. But there's there's a part of you have this human being next to you that's struggling, even if you're not going to make them whole,
Hmm.
don't just step over them while they're laying in the gutter.
Right. Um, there's since I've started this research, I've been looking at statistics on the wealth gap a lot. I'm looking at a lot of statistics on that, and especially with regards to home ownership and how there's a lot of catch up to be done that can't be done while the system still is set up in a way against every minority there is.
So here's here's an interesting thing as far as catching up. Okay, so when I left my parents' house in the inner city, which my mom still lives in that house, I moved to Chez Paris Apartments, which they're townhomes,
Hmm.
and they're right off of Lindbergh.
Okay.
And at that time, there was mostly white people living there. In fact, I lived next door to three flight attendants who, but now that whole area is mostly black because people moved out there.
Right.
And then people that had lighter skin tones moved further west,
Right.
which, so as black people moved to St. Peter's, St. Peter's used to, I remember when I was in high school, St. Peter's seemed like Fayette from the city.
That's a
And,
very good analogy.
and and now that's not the case. Think about all the homes that are going up where what we used to think of just Wentzville being far out, there's even further out than that.
Right, like St. Paul is has so many homes in there now.
I delivered to St. Paul the other night and I was
Right.
like, oh my gosh, look how big that house is.
Yeah, you drive on a one-lane highway and then it opens up to rows and rows of suburban homes.
But there's no black people there yet.
No. And
But there will be. And
eventually
when there is,
they'll go further out.
yes. And it's like the chase. That would be the thing that I would like to see stop. I would like to see us stop chasing that dream and figuring out how to make the dream for ourselves
Hmm.
a reality. Because yeah, I would love to live in this house on acres, except for I don't want to cut the grass, and I'm
Well,
allergic to cut grass, so that wouldn't be good
if
for
you
me.
can afford the home, you can afford a lawn care guy.
Yeah, but I can't. But I have to have air purifier because when they cut all that grass,
Okay.
I'm gonna be sneezing
All right.
ridiculous. But the house that we live in,
Hmm.
there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And people, there are many people that would like to live where we do.
Oh, yes, certainly.
And that's the thing I think we forget is whose dream and whose measure of success are you looking for? Because even the people that are living out there and that, if they haven't, if they're not house poor, they've mortgaged themselves to,
Right.
they're going to be in debt forever.
Sure.
Are you trying to be like the top 1%? Or are you trying to be what that middle slice is where you can be happy? My, I've told you before, my thing for success was be able to pay my bills and be able to take my family on vacation. That was what my
It's pretty
metric of
good.
success was. It wasn't how many cars or how expensive things were, how many rooms or bathrooms the house could have, and all that stuff. It wasn't that.
Hmm.
Like I said, my mom obviously has raised two kids, and she still lives in the house I grew up in,
Right.
and she still looked at as being wealthy in that neighborhood.
Well, that's because she owns a home.
That's true.
That that does it. That's something that a lot of people don't have the opportunity to do. They,
Well, and your mom, bless her heart, used to manage nursing homes in the city, and there were many of her workers that their kids, when they went home at night, they didn't have a bed. They made a pallet. They rolled out blankets or sleeping bags on the floor, and
Mhm.
then in the morning they'd get up and roll them back up and put them in the closet.
Yeah.
And that's the disconnect that we have to figure out. I We talk about Hispanic people all the time that live in our neighborhood, and there's like 6 or 7 of them that share a house.
Right.
Well, if you pay attention, there's multi African American families that are living in some of the houses too. We have that, and then we have the ones that are driving really, really expensive cars.
Right. There. It feels like there's no in between.
But they're all here for the same reason because they want to have a better opportunity for their kids,
Right.
and that's education. Because you start getting to a school, you get to schools that give your child a better chance of having to going to college or even going to a trade school where they can understand what the trade school is teaching them.
Right. Yeah. That's certainly what it all comes down to in the end is just trying to put your kids in an environment where they can, I guess, do better than what you thought you could do for yourself. Almost.
So on that thing where it talked about black churches and whether you attend a black church or not,
Right.
there's a ton of people that live, black families that live in the suburbs that go back to the city to go to church.
It's certainly different.
And because, and that's one way of not losing your culture and not completely acculturating. But I mean, but just think about things that are just like when I was growing up, we used to have house parties. Can
Yeah.
you imagine if
If we
we
threw a
had
house
had,
party,
yeah, can you imagine what
the police would be called as soon as that many black people got out the car.
before just driving down
You're right.
just
They'd be like,
driving
I know who lives there.
down the street?
There's too many cars in their parking lot, in their driveway.
So here's two fun facts that your viewers get. Like, you're talking about things that no, knowing that you're different, living here in this house for what 16 years now.
Yeah.
There's been two times at night that I've been afraid.
Hmm.
Two times, both involved the police. One was our neighbor when her
Oh,
alarm
right,
went off at 3 o'clock in the morning,
right.
and like an idiot, I went
Yeah,
outside to check it out. And I'm thinking, am I going to get shot in my own driveway as the police roll up looking for it?
right.
The second time, but the police were cool. The second time, the police were also cool on this one, was when someone's
I know who
sibling
it is.
thought somebody broke into the house in the middle of the night and text 911. And I look out our window, and there are police with their guns drawn with the flashlights on them surrounding our house. And then the police knock on the door. And I'm like, I'm a black man getting ready to open this door with a policeman that I see with his gun drawn.
Right.
How is this going to go for me? And I remember opening the door slowly with my hands up in
Mm.
my own foyer.
Well, that's what you're just taught to do. I mean, I would have done the exact same thing, and I do not look that dark, but that's the
You got the
safest way to
hair
do
though.
things. I got the hair. That's it.
The hair gives you away.
It's just the safest way to do things. Keep your hands visible on the steering wheel. You get pulled over. Put your hands on the dashboard. It's something that everyone knows that people I don't think realize that that's a thing still.
Yeah, it's the thing. Even and moving to the suburbs hasn't really changed that.
No.
I mean, the one difference is as a kid, the time that I got arrested, I can't believe I'm telling this on YouTube,
Yeah, here we
but
go.
for the curfew violation, even though I was on my friend's porch, yeah, it was like 1, 2 a.m., but we were sitting on his porch, not doing anything, just there because they didn't have air conditioning.
Oh,
And it was one of those nights where it was still 90 degrees.
right.
So we were just on the porch. Police came up, started messing with us.
Yeah. It's stuff like that. It's that I think people think that you can African Americans are running away from when they go to the suburbs, but that's still there. It's just hidden. It's spread out enough that you don't have to see it.
No, going to the suburbs to get away from that would actually makes it worse.
Yeah.
I mean, because it's like you stand out. I remember the first time I went skiing when I was in college.
Hmm.
Wasn't a lot of people of color on that trip, but
Well,
they always said, "Don't worry, Phil. If you fall, we'll be able to find you because you're skiing contrast with the snow."
come on. Oh, come on.
You know that joke was told many times,
Yeah, everyone thought they were original when they said it too.
but I mean, there's just because stereotypes have been ingrained so much that the stereotype is the expected behavior.
Right.
And if you behave differently from the stereotype, it's almost like people don't know what to do with you.
Yeah. It's easier to condense you to a box than to do that.
I do wonder, and I'm sure there's some studies or something somewhere if you look for enough. African Americans that have moved to the suburbs, but have moved to the suburbs where there's groups of African Americans, like pockets, as opposed to just in different places, because you have a way to keep your culture.
It's funny you say that because I do have a peer-reviewed study about that. It's it talks about how when people do move to the suburbs are still incredibly segregated because you move into who is like you. Because that's the safest way to do it.
Exactly. So our situation was different because had also we weren't a totally black family. We were a mixed family, and we moved in the house that your mom grew up in.
Hmm.
But if we were actually moving to the suburbs, moving to a house that we just picked the neighborhood stuff, we would have looked for interracial families. We would have looked for black families, so that what you're talking about would happen.
Right. You know you won't have if you have to deal with anything, you'll have more of a support network behind you to do it.
And you just have somebody that understands what you're going through or the challenge that you have of everyday life. If you don't do that, then you have to try to fit into whatever the cultural dynamic is of that area that you move into in order to be accepted and to feel safe and secure in your own.
Right. Well, we've hit an hour, so I think we're gonna call it there. Thank you so much for your time today, this evening. It's
Well,
11 o'clock.
I hope it was helpful to you and that you're able to use it.
Oh, yes, certainly. I'm planning on writing a transcript as soon as we end the call.
All
So,
right.
where can they find you on your Instagram? You want to give them your socials? You want to get some followers while you're here?
The social media. What is my Instagram? Is it Mufasa 3 or Mufasa 3 Box?
I think it's $3. I'll put it in the description of the YouTube video
There you go.
for you. Um, Thank you. If anyone ends up watching, thank you so much for sticking with us for this hour. I hope you learned something too. Um, if you're part of my research writing class, I hope this was enjoyable. Hope this was different from some of the other things you probably had to listen to.
Well, I would love to if other people do actually watch this, if they've got some follow-up questions, that would be I'm
Yeah,
more than willing to try to answer some of them.
yeah. Leave some questions in the comments. While maybe we'll start a podcast. Who knows? I think that'd be a cool dynamic. We'll see what happens.
I'll keep it 100.
Yeah,
Oh, I'm sorry. I will
yeah.
tell you the truth.
There
I'll
it
shoot
is.
straight.
There
There
it
you
is.
go.
And with that, we're all done here. Thank you.